the next two speakers. Well, so what I've done, all right, the next two speakers will be Al Bielek and Bob Fletcher. I have, in essence, then given them half hour each of the time of Alex Collier, and I'm sure they have an enormous amount of material, and this is really putting the squeeze on them to try to put it into 30 minutes. I'll just tell them to do the best they can, and we know that you'll enjoy and appreciate what they have to say. They also have a workshop scheduled, so this will give you a little more insight into that. So let's bring on Al Bielek, right? Everybody knows practically Al, or practically everybody knows Al, not practically Al. And a lot of you want to hear him, so here he is.
Yeah, I do get the impression that most people know me and have seen me someplace, no matter where I go. Don't have a great deal of time, so what I'm going to do is summarize some new information and basically tell you what I'll be covering in the workshop. There's a great deal of new information. Now, those of you, I believe everyone here has heard of the Philadelphia experiment and knows at least something about what happened in that era. And of course, the vast amount of cover-up that has occurred since then and is still going on. The cover-up, I might add, has taken a new direction, even though the whole entire project, so far as I understand, has been declassified as of 2 years ago. You have a minor problem if you want to get it under Freedom of Information Act. You have to know the docket numbers. And we can't find the docket numbers.
You can use just the lapel mic.
Okay. I'm told the lapel mic will be adequate, so we'll leave it at that. I've had friends try to find it, and they cannot. I have a very good friend who is in the military and has a clearance and access to the government's computers legally. He looked up the files on the Philadelphia experiment. He found quite a bit, including the entire crew list. But there were two strange peculiarities. Number one, the docket numbers have been erased from the computer files, and number two, he couldn't get a printout. It was blocked. Did verify the fact that I was there, Edward Cameron, Captain USN, Duncan Cameron, Captain USN, Jim Cameron, a younger brother, was on that list as an enlisted man. He said there was a fourth Cameron, but he couldn't remember who it was. And also verified the name of my late roommate, whom I knew was on that project. I did finally recall his name as Bill Cody, and it was on that government list. Now, he was an enlisted man. He gave his number, but no background history. The whole business of the Philadelphia experiment takes some very strange twists. I've outlined many times the history of what happened, who was involved, my going into the future, going to Montauk, and my brother with me coming back and all of this. The most interesting part, which I have finally nailed down, and I will not go fully into it, was the real reasons why I was kicked out of the Navy. It wasn't the Navy who did it. I was quite sure of that in the first place, but I have found out finally the reasons. I'll put it this way, because it will involve going into material in my workshop, but I'll give you a very brief outline. I was at Los Alamos, New Mexico, at the Los Alamos Laboratories from July 44 to July 4th, 1947. During that period, of course, the bomb was being developed, and I was there with von Neumann. Von Neumann, of course, was only there off and on, and I did various works for it, mostly report writing. And when the war was over, they asked me to do a classified report on the history and development of the atomic bomb. Found lots of interesting things in the Black Vault, because in those days, they didn't have as tight a security limitation on access as they do now. Then, if you had the clearance level, you had access to the vault. Partly because of what happened with me, and probably for other reasons, you had to have, after that point, not only the clearance level, but a need to know a specific subject matter. That's the way they do it now. That was not the way they did it then. So I went digging around in the vaults, and I found out all kinds of interesting things relative to my report on the history and development of the atomic bomb, one of which was, of course, the Germans had their own bomb developed in the warehouse 2 years before we had ours, and they never used it. We inherited same after the war was over. And they didn't develop it any more than we did. They got it out of the Vedic records and the gold plates because they had expeditions up in Tibet. That's all covered in a new book entitled The Black Sun, and their connection with various secret societies with Tibet and certain sections of Tibet, and the various things they dug out was their scientific research teams were all over the world from 1933 onward, even in parts of Southern California, to an ancient, erect, and derelict city up above Malibu. I know the friend who used to take tours in there. I didn't know there was one there. You don't see it from the ground. I found that material, but then I found something else. How many of you ever heard of a project called Project Southern Cross? You have. Very interesting. More classified than the atomic bomb itself. It involves time travel, a system of time travel which was developed accidentally by our government, found out by accident in 1936, and they finally had it nailed down and calibrated so they knew how to control it to go any time they wanted into the past or into the future from 1938 onward, even before the Germans had their time machines fully developed. It involved Atlantean devices. It seems before Atlantis went down, there was a great deal of commerce all over this planet. They had ships, they had barges, and they also had a very unique system. On the ocean floor at various locations, they had huge crystals, a single-piece crystal, I presume artificially constructed, set on the ocean floor. They would set a barge heavily laden with material, let us say large tonnages of quarried granite that they wanted for something. And rather than using power ships to haul it around, and certainly you're not going to do it with sail, they would park it over this crystal structure, excite certain electronic frequencies and magnetic fields, and the crystal would react and it would transport this barge to the next location. However they managed to calibrate the system, that I don't know. And since there were approximately 10 of these on the planet, they could move heavy cargo almost anywhere as they wanted on the planet. Instantaneously, I might add. A little faster than we can do it now. When Atlantis went down, all of these devices were left in the ocean floor. In 1936, the USS Kearsarge, a virtually brand new carrier, completed about 1935, was doing ocean floor exploration. They had to have an excuse for the use at the time, and that was what they were doing. And they found this crystal formation. Now, they started looking at it, examining it, and of course a modern carrier, even in those days, has large amounts of RF transmissions and traffic and magnetic fields from the generators aboard ship. The next thing you knew, they weren't there anymore. Seems like the area was at the extreme southernmost tip of the area known as the Bermuda Triangle. Actually, over the equator, in the southern hemisphere, a little bit north of the continent of South America, and under the area which astronomically is called in the area of the Southern Cross. That's where the name came from. Ship disappeared. It did come back. I'll go into what happened and how it came back, but they finally found out how to calibrate the system, and they used it for time travel from that point on. What they used it for and how they used it, I will go into in the workshop. But they did use it. I found out about this from the records in the Black Vault, and I blew up. Of course, a few of the very interesting, notable scientists were still there, not very many military. And I made a rather vociferous statement like, if they had this since 1938, what the blazes did they ever bother with the Philadelphia experiment for? They didn't need it in view of something like that, other than for invisibility. They were working, of course, with other aspects with the Philadelphia experiment. I guess there's still more history after the war, which I won't go into now. But in any case, my complaints and my noisy attitude got to the ears of the, shall we say, the wrong people. 3 people whom I will not name because they are still well known in the public eye had a meeting and decided I had to go. 2 out of 3 decided I had to go. I was removed from the Navy over the Navy's actions, objections, if there were any, I don't know. And of course I was transferred under charges of espionage to Washington and then to Montauk, Fort Hero at that time, and given the 9 yards of treatment to erase my memory, make me Al Bielek, and have me grow up again as Al Bielek, and eventually, of course, wind up with my memories essentially back. That was one of the more bizarre aspects of what I found out about what was going on in World War II. And of course prior, as this project was developed. What they used it for was most interesting. I'll only give you a clue. It was part of what was necessary to win World War II, because the Germans were winning it hands down. We did beat them, barely. And how, I will tell you in the workshop. But the fact that I discovered this project, and probably would have talked about it because I did have a habit of talking, even though I was at Los Alamos, got me nailed down and out of the Navy, and my records erased, of course, and never saw the family again. I have uncovered the fact that I do have 4 sons. I've met number 2. He's living in Long Island. And I grew up as Al Bielek, et cetera, et cetera. One of the other aspects which eventually came to light, of course, I've been looking for years for proof of the experiment and what happened. Some years ago, I met a man by the name of Phil Schneider, who was a U.S. government geologist. His father, Oscar Otto Schneider, was the chief medical director for the Philadelphia experiment. I didn't know that, of course. I do remember him now, but I didn't when I first talked with Phil. And he was in charge of the medical aspects, treating the sailors and the officers and seeing what happened, et cetera, et cetera. His history I've covered, I believe, in a prior lecture a year ago, and some of the things that happened to him. And I do have quite a history of them and Phil's videotapes, which I do have 4 of them. But Phil was a man who had a great deal of problems himself. He did go public with his lectures and eventually wound up being murdered on January 10th, 11th of last year. I did inherit some of the material from him and from his wife, ex-wife. Among it was a great deal of material from his father. Some of it I have never shown, some of it I do have in slides. But the more interesting aspect was, in official government stationery, he was writing letters to various other people in the government, in the military primarily, but not entirely, about the Philadelphia experiment, what went wrong, the security problems are engendered, and the 4th letter is perhaps the most interesting of all. In my slides I have pictures of Schneider, of both of them of course. I have pictures of Oscar Schneider aboard ship. I have pictures taken at the last briefing aboard the Eldridge, 9th of August, 1943, in which Oscar Schneider shows, as well as some rather other interesting people. And that was the last briefing. 3 days later, of course, was a disastrous test. The interesting part of that was that my late roommate helped uncover some of the proof. He insisted he was never part of the Philadelphia experiment. I knew he was. I will go into the workshop how he uncovered an interesting piece of proof on one of our trips up to Philadelphia. Because it was in Philadelphia, I uncovered his connection, and he remembered it. But it's the only time he ever remembered any part of it in his prior lifetime. The things that are involved here are quite interesting. I've got copies of the 4 letters. I'll hold them up and the camera can focus in on them so they're in the video record. I do have them in the slides so I can show them in the workshop. The first letter was written 12 December 1944 by Oscar Schneider with a signature. And it was sort of a letter of complaint about this thing. He said, in consideration of the latest facts and considering the fate of DE-173, all ship's personnel and material must be quarantined, absolute until further notice, no exceptions. They did have a 6 months quarantine. And site naval inspection is ordered forthwith as Bureau of Ships reticent requirements in section 93A. I'm not familiar with 93A. Please include in the ship's log to go to Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter. Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter was the first director, if I remember correctly, of MJ-12. Everything is to be considered above top secret and classified under ARH-9 Project Blue Sky and under the signature. If they want to get it in the camera. They do mention the Furioseth. That was an error. The Furioseth was a commercial vehicle. The DE-173 is correct, and of course it is well known to be the Eldridge. Second letter, 17 April 1953, written to a section called 190 RHO USAAF Unit 9, to Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining, of all people. In proper perspective, the Philly Navy Yard's bungling of what should have been a routine, exhaustive search of the U.S. naval vessel DE-173 shows total lack of substance and detail in your department. So here was the Navy taking it out on the Air Force. As of 0600, 21 April 1953, J. Edgar Hoover now requests that all associated personnel be given prior and restrictive psychological testing conducted by the Navy Psychological Unit at Quantico, Virginia. Quantico, Virginia is a Marine base, of course, under control of the Navy. Be it also forthwith that the U.S. Army Intelligence 19 Group be sent to assist any further snafus by U.S. and related personnel. Again, signed by Oscar Schneider. Letter, letter number 3, 23 April 1953, to Dr. E.U. Condon. Ed, please excuse our concern at Washington, U.S. Navy, Washington, something, I can't quite read it exactly, U.S. Navy headquarters over the flap concerning the DE-173. As you might know, this affair has been on our collective minds for some nearly 10 years. As for the subsequent escape of 7 of its original crew from our psychological unit in Virginia, be rest assured of their immediate capture, as Hoover now considers this matter as sectional classification 1A prime directive. Then he goes into some personal stuff with Condon at Boulder, again signed by Schneider. And the final letter is the most interesting of all. 6 March 1955, and it's on Department of the Navy headquarters, paper, Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, Washington, D.C. To C.I. Farnborough, M.D., 47 Rhyolite Section. It's an extremely high-level clearance. ATIC A-13 HTPP. Charles, conducted autopsy on number 9 crew member of the DE-173 with some abnormal conclusions as to foreign materials, perhaps implants, found in number 9 cerebellum, part 14-3. If there's an MD in the audience, you may understand what part 14-3 is. I do not. The subsequent analysis of the 1 1/8 inch long, gold-tipped, fiber-shaped object is something like this. He shows a sketch of it. It has a metallic tip with a large detail at the end. It has some unknown script or writing on it. Can you identify using your analytical methods? 4 of these mysterious devices were removed from number 9's body of DE-173 crew member. As naval cavity also showed implantation, again signed by Schneider. This was done on a sailor while they were in hyperspace in 1943. This type of device was unknown to the military. We had no technology for doing implants in 1943. And this nails down the rumors I had heard that there were aliens on board the ship while it was in hyperspace. How many of the sailors were implanted, we do not know. But we have proof that one was, which is proof there was an alien involvement with that experiment. I have more proofs, more interesting data we'll go into in the workshop. But I wanted to share that much with you in case everybody doesn't make it to the workshop, which usually doesn't happen. There's been other areas of investigation we've gone through, I'm going under, and have been placed under, you might say. In the past, I've mentioned as connected with the Montauk project, the Montauk Boys program. We learned a great deal about that in the meantime. Number one, it was never a government project. It was always private. We knew this in terms of the beginning aspects when it started in 1976 at Montauk. And of course, Montauk from 1976 to 1983 was totally a private project funded by German Reichsbank gold, and when they ran out of that, about 100 billion, a certain corporation that was well known in the electronics field took over. And since they were owned 53% by the Krupps of Germany, it sort of went full circle, so that they continued to fund the operation, even though the government was very interested in it, and oversight had intelligence people in the Montauk project. Not 1 cent of government money or taxpayer money was ever spent on that project. The Montauk Boys program was initiated by the Germans who came over to the U.S. at the end of the war, and even a few during the war, thanks to my father. And of course, one of the principal projects they were concerned with was mind control, and they started that at Brookhaven in 1947. It was transferred to the Montauk operation in 1968 and continued on at least until the end of the Montauk project in 1983. Montauk Phase 1, that is. The Montauk Boys program was actually taken off the Montauk base about 1980, 81, and put under totally private auspices under a private organization with 6 operating bases on Long Island, and as we have learned since, 1 in every major city in the U.S. What we have learned in terms of tracing who is this, who is running it, and what kind of cover they're using is a most interesting and fascinating story. We're still not to the bottom level, but we're getting close. And we have a very good handle on who's running it. It is a worldwide operation. It is run as a cult operation, very much like a religious cult, though it is not a religious cult per se. And the details on that, again, in my workshop. But we have found they are running these operations all over the United States and apparently all over the world. To date, there are approximately 10 million American boys who have been programmed, perhaps more than that. The program is ongoing. And while in the past we used to say, well, who was programmed, they were always selective genetically of their, shall we say, abductees into the program, because the government did literally abduct these people off the streets, not a la UFO type abductions, though the government has that category classification of equipment now. But they would pick them up, move them to Montauk or at base, and process them and then dump them out. The ideal age was around puberty, which could be anywhere from the age of 12 to 17, typically not as high as 17. Average was around 13, 14, 15. Program them, process them, kick them back out to where they came from, and then of course they would be sitting there unknowing of what had happened to them until literally their buttons were pushed. Now, I was asked the question when I was involved in the tail end of this program, what are they programming them for? I was never given an answer. I asked, well, when are they supposed to be used? That I got an answer for. 1995, 96. Of course, this is now 97, and it's beginning to be obvious that these Montauk boys are becoming functional and being used. How many of you watched TV and the presentation of the story of the murder of the international fashion designer in Miami? And, of course, the pictures of Mr. Noonan. Montauk boy, period. One look, I know. Now it's coming out on TV. His family denies that he could possibly have been such a person. He was not that way when he lived at home. We didn't know he was a homosexual, and it was very difficult apparently to find it out. We had no friends that said he was. The first roommate said he was not this way at all. We had no idea that he had this kind of a streak in him. He was kind, loving. He used to do humanitarian projects. He helped people out with various things. He says, none of this happened while, I do not know the name now, but the person was interviewed on TV, none of this happened while he was living with him. Then he went on to number 2 of the string of people he lived with. Number 2 was eventually done and was murdered. And they asked number 1, did number 2 have any suspicion that Mr. Noonan might be this way, might have a murderous streak in him? He says, no, but of course he was dead afterwards. Then of course his whole streak. The question is not, was Mr. Noonan guilty of murder? The question is, who pushed his buttons and why? Why did they want these people out of the way? What was the position of our fashion designer in Washington, who was obviously gay himself? I'm not making any comments on saying he was gay, and he was in and out of the bars and knew a lot of people all over this planet. What were his connections? Who did he know? And why did they want him eliminated? This is the beginning, now showing very clearly, of what the Montauk boys can be used for. There's no question whatever in my mind he was a Montauk boy who may have had a very quiet, docile life up to the point where somebody pushed the button on him. There are all kinds of other problems of assassins, of schoolyard killings without mercy and without reason, fires, arson. There's so much arson in Atlanta where I live, it's unbelievable. I will not be there much longer. I'm going to get out before they get my place. But this is one of the ongoing problems, and it is not diminishing, it is expanding. We could go also into the problems of mind control by means of electronics. This is showing up more and more in the United States. It's also being used for the HARP project. That's one of the secondary goals. Weather control, the weather mod was number one. Number two is now mind control, because the modulation waveforms on the HARP transmitter were confirmed by Dr. Nick Begich as the same as were used on Montauk prior to its current usage. Identical modulation waveforms at the time when Montauk was being used for mind control. Today, Montauk is used for a different purpose: defense of Earth against alien invaders. They have a particle beam weapon system with an output power that's astronomical. For those of you who know engineering, the output power is typically 1 × 10⁻25 power joules. That's more power than a hydrogen bomb by far. With that, they can blow a spaceship apart thousands of miles out in space. Even with the final 5-mile-long linears, they use 2 of them and cross the beams at the focus point in space. Even though they're buried under the ocean, they penetrate the ocean water, whatever reflective device is used for them, up through the water, up through the atmosphere, virtually undiminished in power because it burns everything in its way, and then will do whatever it does in space. They've shot down thousands of UFOs here and in Russia using Montauk systems. The Russians have their own version. There are 36 of these around the planet. They are used for defense of Earth. At least Montauk, since 1993, has finally been used, I think, for something worthwhile. Not that the time research wasn't. We found many interesting things out, but I never approved of the Montauk Boys program, at least the way it was run initially. I will have to admit, in the latter phase, I was involved, but I was only involved because I was able to change it to a far more humanitarian approach. Of course, I was not involved in what they programmed them for. I had no control over that. There's a lot more that's been going on undercover on this planet. Our government, or should I say more accurately, the secret government knows what's going on. They know about the alien wars under our feet. They're involved in it. They know about the potentials for invasion. They know at some level the alien involvement in our government, foreign governments, and the UN. And the thing is a real mishmash. It's very difficult to figure out who's doing what to whom anymore, and who is about, if anyone, is about to come out on top. They're really fighting for control as to who is going to control. In the meantime, the earth changes are starting to creep up on us and may solve the problem for us before the New World Order actually totally imposes its will. Our workshop is tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. I will go into much more detail, and my time is just about out. Very briefly, is there any questions I can answer until the time runs out? Yes, the lady there.
Do you think that had anything to do with Flight 800, TWA?
No. Flight 800 is a totally different story. That was a major military maneuver and testing of a new computer control system, which was to be able to selectively identify friendly craft, neutrals, and enemy. They set up a bogus enemy in the terms of an air-breathing missile, which was fired on the northern part of Long Island, south over the ocean. They launched a Navy missile, a very large one, with a dummy warhead. That's what the story is. I'm not so sure it was dummy. And it was to be under computer control, guided to shoot down this drone, which was to be classed as the enemy. It had to be done in the metropolitan area to prove the system's capability of differentiating between electronic background clatter, which New York has tons of it, friendly ID, neutrals, and the enemy. They fired the missile to shoot down the drone. Someplace right after that, the electronic systems, 3 of them, because they had backups, failed, and the missile was on its own. It had its own system for seeking out something. It did. It locked on Flight 800 and plowed right through it. That shows in the reconstructed aircraft. Now, all the stories say it was an unarmed missile. The question is, was it? Because a friend of mine was involved in examination of the aircraft instrumentation they brought up from the ocean bottom. They know there was a missile because of the red rocket fuel on the certain seats, but he found all of the aircraft instrumentation have been badly damaged due to EMP effect. That's electromagnetic pulse effect, which you only get from a nuclear detonation. The other interesting aspect of that flight was that The original announcement of the crew and rather passengers was 289. It went down the next day to 259. The final assessment was 229 passengers, with, of course, at that point releasing the flight manifest. What happened to the other 60? And how come they had 54 crew members on a flight for a 747? There's a lot of unanswered questions. The government will never, in my view, give a complete, true answer because it's too embarrassing to them. I have 1 minute left. One more question. Yes, you have it in the microphone.
Yes. Where's the safest place to be when they have earth changes? Like what state?
They're already started. The bad weather is somewhat artificial, somewhat natural. And my recollections from my data from the trips in the future was that they become nasty next year, but there's nothing compared to what they're going to be by the year 2000. From the year 2000 on, they get so bad that all the governments in the world collapse. The military takes over under martial law to try and preserve order and preserve whatever they can of society and civilization. There are areas of the U.S. escape damage. But the biggest problem is the loss of power, loss of transportation, loss of fuel transport, and a very serious situation. Time is over. I will hopefully see you all in my workshop tomorrow afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al. All we have to do is take enough time to get rewired for Bob. All right, as they say then, moving right along, and now, Bob Fletcher. Here it comes.
Maybe I'm on.
Here he is.
Said they're going to get rewired. I was wired before I even got here. I don't know about the rest of you guys. What I'm going to do, I have several very specific, of course I don't know how to turn this on. Somebody will tell me how to do that. I have several different specific subjects that I've done rather heavy-duty investigative research on, not counting the old material which involved my involvement with the CIA and being taken advantage of with its all old story, so to speak, at this time. The program I will be doing tomorrow will be probably primarily on weather control, and I'm going to do some of that now, but I also want to hit on, I'm just going to kind of skip through a handful of real interesting pieces of material that I have. They're going to be random subjects, so to speak. I will touch probably maybe a little bit on the CIA drug connections. I must say, as a matter of fact, and I'm going to struggle with these, bear with me if you will, I'm a one-armed bandit at this point. I'll struggle through my, my material the best I can. By the way, I'm going to show you folks this. This is a very poor picture. That's what's in my shoulder. That's the insert that was put in when I was hit about 1 year ago, literally, by one of the exotic weapons that we're talking about. More than likely, it was a microwave. It's a microwave system that was set up, actually created at Oak Ridge Laboratories. The basics of that is not so much for shooting people's arms and doing that type of damage. Basically what it does, it causes two things or three things. It causes seizures and cardiac arrest. That's the basic point of the of that particular weapon. It's a microwave, not laser. It's a different animal. When I was hit with it, it was 1:30 in the morning. I was sound asleep in bed. It was done through a double sliding glass door, which is about 18 inches from my side of the bed. I was laying on my back, just as you see me here with this side to the window. I didn't know what was happening. I simply, as a matter of fact, the way it took place, I had been doing East Coast speaking engagements in New York and Illinois, mostly on the weather control, which is another version of the same thing. The weather control is done by heating the ionosphere altering the negative and positive and charges in the atmosphere with heat, and it's done with a plasma beam, which basically is Tesla's old. Those of you that know Tesla and those of you that don't know who he is, that's too bad. I'm not going to get into that. But this brilliant, unbelievable scientist of the 1800s that really, and as a matter of fact, he's the guy that gave us alternating current, and about every other electrical switch and meter and motor that we're familiar with now came out of his patents. He discovered some of the most bizarre elements that presently are being used. And as a matter of fact, what's interesting, he was concerned when he came upon these and created them and discovered them that they would be used in the future in a negative manner. And unfortunately, he's absolutely right, and that's what's happening. But all of these microwave lasers, et cetera, for the most part, are spin-offs from Tesla's old information. This particular microwave basically, as a matter of fact, they have them small enough, and lasers small enough to be simply carried now by single soldiers. It used to be that quite a while back when they were originally creating them, it took so much power, et cetera, that it was a huge facility, and maybe, would have to be in something like a tank or what have you. They are now micro-sized sufficiently that they are individual hand-carried weapons in most cases. This microwave that they did their trick on with me is one that creates seizures. What happened that evening was that I simply went to sleep at 10:30 at night. At 1:30 in the morning, I woke up. I had this unbelievable pain in my right shoulder, and my mouth, I was bleeding out of my mouth, and there were two little guys in white uniforms at the base of my bed, and my wife was next to me, and she said, "Everything's going to be all right. They're going to take you to the hospital." It's like, hello, here. I just went to sleep at 10:30. Everything was fine, and now I'm being juggled off to the hospital. And my arm was unbelievable. And the little guys with the white uniforms were simply the ambulance people, and they were putting oxygen in me and helping me onto the stretcher and taking me to the hospital. And my wife said, "You had a grand mal seizure," which to me was really bizarre because I was very healthy. And I've never ever in my life even had a dizzy spell, if you will, okay? So that was pretty strange, but she was the one that was there awake and I wasn't. We realized my shoulder, originally they just thought it was extremely radically out of socket. And but my first concern, which was really bizarre to me, besides the shoulder problem, was the fact that I had had a seizure. And my wife said she was awakened by that seizure. Fortunately, she's a light sleeper. And she said that it was almost 5 minutes of a continuous grand mal seizure, which is extremely long to be in that situation. She knew that because she called 911 and looked at the clock. We're rather close to the hospital that was the closest emergency service, not too far away, as a matter of fact, at all. And it was like I continued convulsing for probably 3.5 to 4 minutes, and she didn't hear the siren, so she called again. So she was very much aware of the period of time. Now, what took place was as soon as the ambulance came around the corner down the street, maybe a block away, and with their sirens going, the seizure stopped instantly. All right? So somebody took their finger off the trigger. Now, when I got to the hospital, and I was very together in a very short period of time, it didn't take me long at all. By the time, a few minutes, and I was as a matter of fact, in the ambulance, I already had my senses. I was very, very much aware. The first thing I said to them is, I want every single test that you can give me for this. Number one, I want to know if I have epilepsy. What is the possibility of that at an older age developing? And that does happen, but not terribly often. And but I said, whatever it is, I need to know what it is, all right? And because I still didn't have a good handle on the possibility of being hit with the microwave weapon. They gave me all the tests. I'm going to compress all this because I want to show you some other neat stuff. I had them give me completely a CAT scan. They gave me the, I'm not a medical, so what is it, EKG, ECG, ABCDFG, or whatever they think. You know, where they hook you up and see if you got any brain whatsoever and all the rest of that. But the bottom line is they gave me everything, all the tests. They came back the following day and they said, absolutely nothing wrong with you. Of course, they don't really know me, but they said absolutely nothing wrong with you at all. They showed me the brain scan, and not even being a physician, I could see it was very, I'd say, unbelievably consistent, which some people would argue that case, but nonetheless, there was absolutely no reason. There is absolutely no way I could have destroyed my shoulder. There was no external damage to my shoulder. My shoulder was so badly destroyed, and you can see, and not very good, and I apologize, this is a horrible triple reproduction here. But this is the end of my bone of my arm, which is here someplace. It was totally broken off at that point. And we're not talking a little bit or whatever. It was totally broken off. And the upper part of my ball of my shoulder itself was fragmented, blown up. And to describe it, the surgeon, one of the surgeons that did the surgery said, it looked like a bomb had gone off in your shoulder, Mr. Fletcher. No external damage whatsoever. I never struck anything. I was on the inside of the bed, this side to my wife. And after going back over some Tesla information, believe it or not, 100 years old, 1898, I think, was when the date was on it. Tesla himself, when he used to do demonstrations to students, he used to illuminate himself with some of these very same electromagnetic waves and micro-type waves. As an experiment, he would actually hook himself up, touch up on this stuff, and his whole body would illuminate. And then he would talk and explain what was happening. And son of a gun, 100 years ago, in his writings himself, he said, now, as long as it's at this degree of wavelength, et cetera, it's not hurting me, it's being dispersed throughout my body evenly. He says if it was changed in a certain degree, it might cause a heart attack, you know, if it was changed in some manner. But he says if it was to exit the solid part of the bone, like in your arm, it would cause extreme damage. And that's actually in a 100-year-old presentation that Tesla himself was doing on basically the same thing. Apparently that's what happened, and I didn't have a heart attack, and I didn't die, I don't think. And so I was fortunate on that side of it. But I just answered everybody's question relative to what had taken place with my shoulder. And the only problem, I'm still having trouble with it now, unfortunately, the entire insert itself was not done properly. So I have pain 24 hours a day. I've lost I have really no movement here. All of this part of my arm, my elbow, my hand, my wrist, and everything else is fine. I have no problem with that. I can move everything from here. It's just not really connected properly here. If I leave it down like this, it becomes unbelievably painful from the weight down. Keeping it up like this for a long time, it becomes painful pushing it up. So I'm kind of in between, but it hurts all the time, and that's too bad, but maybe I'll get it repaired, and if I don't, that's tough. I'm going to have to handle it. This is interesting. I'm going to skip over some things very important from a variety of investigative research. Everybody talks about the year 2000, that the bad guys are going to finally crash on us in the year 2000. There's been no real good, there's random documentation on it, and we certainly can assume that. But the most amazing piece was this particular letter. It's about a 14-page letter. It's the summary, if you can see it, or the title is Governance, Global Governance. I thought that was an interesting word, because we've been talking about global government, okay? And by the way, this is from the Secretary General of the United Nations, I believe a Swedish fellow at this point in time, if I remember correctly. This was done in '94. When I saw the word governance, I thought, oh, that's kind of neat. What they've done is changed it here. See, they're not saying world government, they're saying governance. And I didn't know what it meant, to be honest with you. And I went to the dictionary and I looked it up, and one means governing and one means the act of governing. So it's not much of a deviation. The important part is this, page 15. Son of a gun. Look where the arrow is, if you can read it. I don't know if you can't. It's okay. Basically, and I put it up just for so that you know this exists. basically what it says is our recommendation is that the General Assembly should, matter of fact, I need my glasses. Can you make that better? Or are we all blind? I don't know. So without my glasses, I don't know. Oh yeah, it's printing. Anyhow, it says, our recommendation is that the General Assembly should agree to hold the World Conference on Governance in 1998 with its decisions to be ratified and put into effect by 2000 that will allow 2 years for the preparatory process. Period. That's it, sport fans. That's the end of the story. So when anybody says, well, there's no proof of it, baloney. The rest of the letter shows things like it says, we utilize organizations, non-governmental NGOs, non-government organizations to convince and bring on the rest of the American people to understand, or the world actually, to accommodate and come on board on the one world government, period. The United Nations paperwork, I have the entire letter, I didn't bring it here, and it actually becomes too much to show you at this point. Matter of fact, this is, let's see if I got this right. This is the cover letter that comes with it. It's signed by Peter Oswald, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Sweden to the United Nations, and it is the General Assembly 50th session, and that was done right at, as a matter of fact, it's dated 1995, February 1995. So if anybody tells you you're crazy and these are all illusionary things that people are making up, that's not the case. I'm finishing up, I utilize, this is actually out of a U.S. World Report magazine only a few weeks ago, a cover story, all right, on the exotic weapons we're talking about, which is funny or strange or peculiar. I get a big kick out of it because I'm just about to finish up my new video, which is an expose on all of these weapons. Lasers, microwaves, supersonic sound weapons, etc. They're totally finished, they're done, they're mounted on equipment, they're manufactured already to the availability for soldiers to individually carry these guns and these weapons. It's a done deal. It's not something that's almost done. And when Al was talking earlier and talking about the microwave and its relationship to the weather control, etc., it's all the same stuff. If the combinations, first off, there's 4 major types of these darn things. By the way, my videotape includes live footage of all of them. All right? It includes live footage of lasers, handheld and small ones and some bigger ones. It includes live footage of something that Al touched on in terms of the mind control, the electronic potential mind control. There is what I would call the weapon of all weapons. If originally I thought weather control would be it. All right, they're presently doing weather control, 3 major stations, 1 in Alaska, 2 near the equator, and coordinating with Russians. The Russians have several places where they do it, electronic, they're cooperating to do this stuff. All this lousy weather, absolute bizarre weather. Let me correct myself. Probably 80% of it is being cultivated or managed at this point in time. It does include earthquakes, sorry about that. It does include all other types of weather, rain and flood. The North Korean drought, which is killing every person in North Korea, is manufactured. It's period, done deal, okay? The babies are dying in their mother's arms. It's just like it's been in Africa, except in Korea. It's all over there. They don't have enough water and rice to even, they're doling out half a cup of rice per person and a couple of cups of water. That's where it's the way it's in North Korea. Pretty good weapon. North Korea didn't come on board with the New World Order concept. Well, you're out of here. So that's how that works. The floods all over the world, the droughts all over the world are all interconnected with each other. Okay, period. And it's being manufactured. To get back to the smaller weapons, which are lasers, which are individual type laser guns that do amazing damage. I have live footage of witnesses in a Panama invasion where a couple of the Delta Force type characters were down there with backpack lasers. They melted people like little balls of maple syrup with lasers. They have another microwave type unit. They can aim at you, blast your brain, and if they cut your head open, it would pour out of your head. Your brain would pour out of your ears. They have what they call vector weapons, which is sort of like an air blast, a super hypersonic air blast to be shot at you. You wouldn't hear it, see anything at all. You could be walking down the street and it'll knock you 25 feet backwards, like you've been hit by a baseball bat. In the air blast itself, they can include the chemical and biological weapons, or the materials, which makes it obviously that type of a weapon at the same time. That's the vector weapons. The lasers, and then the supersonic sound weapons they've even worked on all the way back 50 years ago. They had supersonic sound weapons that they were working on in the... As a matter of fact, this laser, in the laboratories, they were working on this stuff 1948. These laser weapons, this is the one that will just blind you, blow your eyes out. You know, by the way, these are all labeled non-lethal. Makes me feel really good. You know, if you can imagine, several pilots recently have been blinded by, they're just experimenting, fooling around with it. Commercial pilots, been blinded by lasers and reported in, had to have their co-pilots take over. It's California, New York, and several other places recently, right here in America. You know, the idiot newspapers wrote a story up and said they thought it was high school kids fooling around with those lasers that you get from Radio Shack. I'm serious. Front page story in California. They said they thought some kids were fooling around. I called the guy back up, but that's another story. We had a little conversation. The problem with the lasers, people say, well, you know, if you think you're going to be blinded, you can wear goggles. They simply switch the frequency on the lasers. You're going to have 15 goggles. One goggle will work if you're on the same frequency. If you've got the different goggle, the one that's not right for whatever laser beam you're being shot with, it won't make any difference. They'll blind you. Put this guy up. You remember him? That's your local police officer. Remember when your mother and father told you if you ever got lost when you were a kid, you'd go up and ask the policeman on the block and he'll show you how to get home? Can you imagine having your 4-year-old go up to this sucker and ask him where to... Whatever. That's George Bush's police, folks. Now let me give you I'm going to hit real quick because I want to run out of time on some of the weather control, the good documentation on weather control. If I can find the best of it here. Excuse me? Well, oh, all right. Excuse me. Yeah, that guy's one of your favorite policemen on the corner. See, and unfortunately, because this was a surprise to me, this is not in an order that it normally would be. Let me go back to this. 1948. You know, people, and as Al mentioned about the amazing stuff that was going on so long ago. 1948, they were doing ultrasonic, supersonic sound experimentation. This literally are a combination of laboratory photographs in 1948. This is material being ignited by sound waves from across the room, being burst into flames. That's a guy holding a piece of cotton. You can make that out there. The sound waves they were dealing with in 1948, guys, 1948, the sound waves they were dealing with was 3 million vibrations a second in 1948. Now, at this point in time, believe it or not, that same study work, or at this point as far as the ability of sound, is 25 or 30 times that in the sound waves. This is a laboratory photo. It shows them taking condensation and hitting it back then and converting it into rain. 1948, 50 years ago. This shows you a simple scale. You know, the average human ear is at 20,000 vibrations a second. See, so the 3 million, the bat's at 100,000. 3 million is a fairly serious high level of vibration. You will get a kick out of this. 1948, all of this stuff's from the very same laboratory. It's backwards. What you see here, they're levitating solid mass with sound vibrations. Those are ball bearings floating in the air with what they have neutralized sound coming from the top and the bottom, and actually balancing, levitating in midair with sound waves in 1948. You know, folks talk, when they ask you and they tell you, well, that, you know, that's old Buck Rogers stuff when you get talking about lasers and all that type of thing. The microwave oven, you have to remember this, the microwave oven was given to us about 35 years ago for us dummies to, you know, heat our water and burn our hamburgers with, right? That's a microwave laser gun. That's what that is. Now, how far do you imagine 35 years ago they already were with that when they decided to sell it to the stupid old average people out here, right? To give it to us dummies so we could burn our hamburgers. By the way, what happened to my shoulder is the same thing that will happen if you put a grape in a paper cup and run it for 30 seconds in your microwave. Or like the lady did when she wanted to dry her poodle quickly in Miami Beach. Give me a break. She gave Fifi a shampoo. She's rushing to get to the grocery store. She put her damn poodle in the microwave and put it on for 20 seconds. She's still cleaning out. All her food tastes funny now. I don't recommend that. Don't do that experiment at home. May Fifi rest in peace. Matter of fact, I didn't eat the chicken barbecue here just because of that the other day. Anyhow, this shows you the destruction of, I'm going to say, human tissue. Of course, this is a mouse. But this is from sound waves. It apparently had no other effect on the mouse at that time. His ears are fine. About a week later, his ears are half gone. And at the last picture, you can see his ears are totally just burnt off by the high-frequency sound. Now, all of this is the same stuff, if you will, the same material that they're controlling the weather with. Now, some of the great documentations that are included in my videotape and the paperwork, all of this that you're seeing here is in printed paperwork, comes free with a videotape. This is the hearings in '77 that ended up secret behind closed doors. They started open and it became under the table relative to weather modification and control back at that time.
Is there a number on that hearing?
Yes, certainly there is. Number 32, October 26, 1977. 76 and 77 was when they really got cranked up with their interest on this thing. This is neat. Good old United States government. This is a standard form, as you can see. Standard form that you have to fill out if you're going to screw up with the government, or excuse me, screw with the weather that particular day. So when they say, so you can see it at the top there, initial report for weather modification. So if you're going to go out and shoot some stuff up and ruin the weather someplace or cause a flood, they want to make sure they have the basic form filled out. You know, but the government's unbelievable, right? When I spoke before the U.S. Senate, of course, they didn't know anything about it. When I spoke before the Senate, they thought it was silly, Mr. Fletcher. Why could you ever even imagine that? This is the the government of Canada has a standard weather modification or an act, a policy, excuse me. We have a weather modification control policy in the United States. It's a regular policy. Now, I'm running out of time. And whatever. So I don't have, there's 80 pages of amazing documentation related to the weather control. And believe it or not, I just received declassified information. This is it here. Declassified from the Air Force. This has in it every laser gun, including the ones that Al was talking about, that they shoot down into the water and back out, etc., the satellite stuff. This has in it also the latest aircraft they have. Remember in Phoenix, how many of you saw that story where these guys saw what they thought were flying saucers, these lights that flew across and hovered and all of that? That aircraft is in here. It's our aircraft. It's a huge flying wing. What they were looking at were lines of lights underneath the flying wing. They're in here completely. It's a complete description of it. If you want to, you can come by. I don't have copies of it, but these are the actual descriptions of each of these weapons, what they can do, how they do it, what the strength is, and etc. This is the flying wing that they saw in Phoenix, the lights underneath of it. I'm going to be doing, I'll be doing a workshop tomorrow. If you're interested, what I'm going to do is ask folks if you want me to particularly go totally into the weather control, if you want to go into the weapons, laser weapons, things like that, whichever, it makes no difference to me. I'll be glad to scare the hell out of you on either side.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob.